September 1st, 1943. USS Independence, somewhere in the Central Pacific. The morning briefing had ended 10 minutes ago, but Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Loesch remained seated in Fighting Squadron 6's ready room, studying reconnaissance photographs of Baker Island with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Around him, 23 other Hellcat pilots performed their own pre-flight rituals. Some checked fuel calculations for the third time. Others recited attack procedures under their breath, like incantations against an uncertain future. The air operations officer's voice crackled through the ready room speaker. VF6, man your aircraft. Loesch climbed the external ladder to his F6F Hellcat, bureau number 41212, and settled into the cockpit that still smelled of fresh paint and hydraulic fluid. The big Grumman fighter had arrived aboard Independence just 6 weeks earlier, one of the first production Hellcats to reach the Pacific Theater. Everything about the machine felt different from the Wildcats that Loesch had trained on in Jacksonville. Heavier, more powerful, deliberately built for a specific purpose that Navy fighter pilots understood without speaking it aloud: to kill the Zero. For 20 months, that purpose had existed as an abstract strategy rather than tactical reality. The Mitsubishi A6M had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor, with performance characteristics that made it nearly invincible in the hands of Japan's veteran naval aviators. American pilots flying Wildcats had developed elaborate defensive tactics, the thach weave and high-side diving attacks, specifically designed to avoid prolonged combat with an aircraft that could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver anything the United States Navy could put against it. But today, strapped into 12,500 pounds of Grumman-engineered response to that problem, Loesch represented something fundamentally different, not adaptation to Japanese air superiority, not tactical workarounds for inferior equipment, but mathematical reversal of Pacific War fighter performance equations through engineering solutions that had taken 18 months of compressed development to perfect. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine ahead of him produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double what powered the Zero. His 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns carried 400 rounds per weapon, enough ammunition for 40 seconds of sustained fire compared to the 7 seconds typical of earlier naval fighters. An armor plate behind his seat and around the oil cooler added 212 pounds of protection that Japanese fighters sacrificed for weight savings and maneuverability. Independence turned into the wind. Loesch advanced throttle and felt the Hellcat accelerate down the wooden deck with a directness that eliminated the careful power management required by less powerful fighters. At 75 knots, the big Grumman lifted off the bow and climbed away from the carrier with the purposeful efficiency of an industrial product engineered to precise specifications. 24 Hellcats formed up over the task force and turned northwest toward Baker Island. Loesch flew as section leader in the 2nd Division, maintaining position through subtle aileron inputs, while his mind rehearsed the combat procedures that had been drilled into him during months of training. Maintain speed above 230 miles per hour. Use altitude advantage for boom and zoom attacks. Never attempt to turn fight with Zeros. Trust the armor. Trust the guns. Trust the math. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Coast Watcher's intelligence brief had mentioned a Japanese flying boat operating in the area, probably conducting reconnaissance for Tarawa Garrison forces. Loesch spotted it 40 minutes into the patrol, a Kawanishi H-8K Emily 4-engine patrol aircraft that the Japanese Navy used for long-range maritime surveillance. Flying low and slow, completely unaware that 24 American fighters were descending on its position, the engagement lasted 11 seconds. Loesch opened fire at 400 yards, his 650s converging on the Emily's port wing route. The big flying boat shed aluminum fragments as 50 caliber rounds punched through its unarmored structure. Secondary explosions blossomed along the fuselage as fuel tanks ruptured. The Emily rolled inverted and hit the Pacific in a cascade of white spray that marked the first aerial victory credited to a Grumman F6F Hellcat. But standing on Independence's flight deck 90 minutes later, watching maintenance crews swarm over his aircraft to analyze gun camera footage and examine ammunition expenditure, Loesch understood that destroying an unescorted patrol bomber proved nothing about the Hellcat's true capabilities. The real test, the definitive question that would determine whether Grumman's design team had actually solved the Zero problem, remained unanswered by his morning's work. Could the Hellcat defeat Japanese naval fighters in air-to-air combat? Or had the United States Navy simply produced another heavy, powerful aircraft that Japanese pilots would dance around like matadors toying with an exhausted bull? The answer would have to wait 3 more months, but the question itself represented a profound shift in American naval aviation thinking. To understand why 24 Hellcat pilots flew operational patrols in September 1943, carrying fundamentally different assumptions about fighter combat than their predecessors, it's necessary to examine the extraordinary 18-month development process that transformed Grumman's initial fighter concept into the most successful naval aircraft of the Pacific War. In June 1941, as Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union and Japanese forces occupied French Indochina, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation received Navy Bureau of Aeronautics contracts for 2 experimental fighter prototypes designated XF6F1. The specifications called for a carrier-based fighter that could defeat the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, whose capabilities were becoming increasingly clear through combat reports from China and intelligence assessments of Japanese naval aviation development. The challenge was straightforward to define but extraordinarily difficult to solve. The Zero achieved its legendary maneuverability and climb performance through radical weight reduction that eliminated pilot armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy armament in favor of maximum agility. Japanese naval aviation doctrine emphasized individual pilot skill in close-range dogfighting, believing that superior training and aircraft maneuverability would overcome any disadvantages in firepower or protection. American naval aviation faced a different set of requirements. Carrier operations demanded rugged airframes, capable of withstanding harsh shipboard handling and the violent stresses of catapult launches and arrested landings. Pacific theater distances required substantial fuel capacity and long-range performance, and American military philosophy prioritized pilot survival through armor protection and aircraft redundancy that increased weight but dramatically improved combat survivability. Grumman's chief engineer, William Schwendler, and project engineer, Robert Hall, understood that attempting to match the Zero's turning performance would require American designers to abandon the very characteristics that made carrier-based fighters operationally effective in the vast Pacific theater. Instead, they pursued a fundamentally different approach. Make it faster, make it more heavily armed, make it capable of absorbing battle damage that would destroy a Zero, and most importantly, make it powerful enough to dictate the terms of engagement through altitude and speed advantages that would allow American pilots to attack when conditions favored them and disengage when they didn't. The initial XF6F1 prototype flew on June 26, 1942, powered by a Wright R2600 Cyclone engine producing 1,700 horsepower. Test pilot Robert Hall completed the maiden flight from Grumman's Bethpage, Long Island facility and reported generally positive handling characteristics. But performance calculations made it clear that the R2600 engine, while reliable and well understood, simply didn't provide enough power to give the new fighter decisive advantages over the Zero. 4 days after the XF6F1's first flight, Navy Bureau of Aeronautics analysts studying the Midway battle results recognized patterns that would fundamentally influence American fighter development. The massive carrier battle fought June 4th through 7th had demonstrated that Japanese naval aviation retained formidable striking power despite losing 4 fleet carriers. Zero fighters had continued to dominate individual engagements through superior maneuverability, even as American dive bombers destroyed the carriers those fighters were supposed to protect. The lesson was clear. Matching the Zero's turning performance remained impossible given American operational requirements. But eliminating the Zero's tactical advantages through overwhelming power, armor, and firepower represented an achievable engineering solution. On April 26, 1942, Even before the XF6F1's first flight, the Bureau of Aeronautics had directed Grumman to redesign the fighter around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine. This massive 18-cylinder radial produced 2,000 horsepower, 300 more than the R2000, 600, and nearly double the output of the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine. The R2800 was already powering both the Vought F4U Corsair and Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, but those aircraft faced development problems that delayed their operational deployment. Grumman moved with remarkable speed. The second prototype, redesignated XF6F3 to reflect its new power plant, first flew on July 30, 1942, just 34 days after the XF6F1's maiden flight. Robert Hall reported immediately that the extra power transformed the aircraft's performance envelope. The climb rate improved dramatically, top speed increased to 380 miles per hour, and most importantly, the big Hellcat retained excellent handling characteristics despite adding nearly 1,000 pounds of additional weight. The transformation wasn't simply about raw power. The R2800 engine's reliability and maintainability matched Grumman's design philosophy of producing simple, robust aircraft that could operate effectively under the harsh conditions of carrier warfare. Everything about the Hellcat reflected this utilitarian approach. Straight wings with simple geometry, conventional control surfaces, straightforward hydraulic and electrical systems, no experimental technology, no unproven innovations, just systematically engineered solutions to clearly defined problems. By October 1942, just 16 weeks after the XF6F3's first flight, the first production F6F3 Hellcat rolled off Grumman's assembly line. The speed of this development represented an extraordinary achievement in military aviation, made possible by Grumman's decision to design the aircraft for maximum manufacturability from the beginning. Plant 3 at Bethpage was still under construction when the first Hellcats entered production, with assembly lines forming inside partially completed factory buildings. But speed of development meant nothing if the aircraft couldn't perform as intended in combat. Throughout late 1942 and early 1943, Navy test pilots at Patuxent River Naval Air Station conducted exhaustive performance trials, comparing the Hellcat against captured Zero fighters and analyzing how American pilots could exploit the F6F's characteristics to overcome Japanese tactical advantages. The test results revealed a complex picture that defied simple assessment. The Zero retained superior low-altitude climb rate and turning radius. Below 14,000 feet, a well-flown Zero could outclimb the Hellcat and complete tighter turns at lower speeds. Japanese pilots maintaining traditional dogfighting tactics would retain significant advantages in visual range combat where maneuverability determined outcomes. But above 14,000 feet, the performance equation reversed. The Hellcat's climb rate matched or exceeded the Zero's, giving American pilots altitude advantages in the medium to high altitude bands where most Pacific combat occurred. The F6F's maximum speed of 380 miles per hour compared to the Zero's 331 miles per hour provided American pilots with the ability to initiate or break off combat at will, and the Hellcat's diving performance far exceeded anything the Zero could achieve, allowing escape through high-speed dives that the lighter Japanese fighter couldn't safely follow. Most significantly, the Hellcat's armor protection and rugged construction meant it could absorb battle damage that would destroy a Zero instantly. A Zero struck by 50 caliber machine gun fire typically caught fire or shed critical components. A Hellcat hit by the same weapons often continued flying, its pilot protected by armor plate, its fuel contained in self-sealing tanks, its structure strong enough to withstand damage that would cripple lighter aircraft. The tactical implications were profound. American pilots couldn't dogfight with Zeros and expect to win through superior maneuverability, but they could use altitude, speed, and firepower to dictate engagement terms, attacking from advantageous positions and refusing combat when conditions didn't favor them. The Hellcat wasn't a better dogfighter than the Zero. It was a different kind of fighter entirely, optimized for a different tactical philosophy that emphasized coordinated team tactics over individual aerobatic skill. By February 1943, the first operational Hellcat squadron, VF9, began carrier qualifications aboard USS Essex. The pilots transitioning from Wildcats to Hellcats found the new fighter easy to fly despite its size and power. The wide landing gear track provided excellent stability during carrier landings. The big wings generated substantial lift at low speeds, making approach speeds manageable even for relatively inexperienced pilots. And the R2800 engine's reliability meant mechanical failures rarely interrupted operations, but technical capabilities meant nothing without pilots trained to exploit them effectively. Throughout the spring and summer of 1943, as more Hellcat squadrons formed and began training, Navy fighter tacticians developed doctrines specifically designed to maximize the F6F's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. Section leaders learned to maintain altitude advantage through careful fuel management and tactical positioning. Wingmen practiced mutual support tactics that prevented Japanese fighters from isolating individual American aircraft, and every pilot memorized the cardinal rule of Hellcat combat: never turn fight with a zero. Use your speed, use your dive performance, use your firepower, hit hard, hit fast, and get out before the enemy can respond. That was the Hellcat way of war, and it represented an entirely different approach to fighter combat than the swirling dogfights that Japanese pilots expected. By late summer 1943, 15 Hellcat squadrons had completed training and begun deploying to the Pacific Fleet. The aircraft that had existed only as engineering drawings 18 months earlier now represented the Navy's primary answer to Japanese air superiority. But the fundamental question remained unanswered through any empirical evidence that would satisfy combat pilots whose lives depended on accurate performance assessments. Could the Hellcat actually defeat the Zero in sustained air combat? Fighting Squadron 33 arrived at Guadalcanal in late August 1943, carrying the weight of institutional expectations that extended far beyond their 24 aircraft complement. VF-33 was the first land-based Hellcat unit to deploy to an active combat zone, and their performance would provide the initial data points for validating or disproving Grumman's design philosophy. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Leonard Davis, had assembled an unusually experienced group of pilots. 12 had previous combat experience, most flying Wildcats during the Guadalcanal campaign. They understood intimately the tactical limitations of earlier American fighters and approached the Hellcat with a mixture of hope and professional skepticism, born from months of fighting aircraft they knew were inferior to their Japanese opponents. The terrain around Guadalcanal remained scarred from the brutal 6-month campaign that had ended just 7 months earlier. Henderson Field, the airstrip that thousands of Marines and sailors had died to capture and defend, now served as a forward operating base for American air operations against Rabaul, the massive Japanese fortress at the northern end of the Solomons chain. The strategic situation had reversed since 1942, with American forces now conducting offensive operations, but Japanese naval aviation still fielded thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of experienced pilots. VF-33's first combat mission, a strafing attack against the Japanese seaplane base at Regatta Bay on August 30th, served primarily as familiarization with combat operations. The Hellcats demolished the base facilities and destroyed several flying boats, but encountered no air opposition. The pilots returned to Henderson Field with gun camera footage showing their .50 caliber rounds tearing through undefended structures, but no answers to the questions that actually mattered. The morning of October 5, 1943, began with intelligence reports indicating heavy Japanese air activity over Bougainville. Fighter Command ordered VF-33 to conduct a sweep over the northern Solomons, providing top cover for bomber formations attacking Japanese shipping. 20 Hellcats launched from Henderson Field at 08:30 hours and climbed to 20,000 feet, forming up in divisions of 4 aircraft each while maintaining precise spacing that allowed mutual support without compromising formation flexibility. Lieutenant Commander Davis led the sweep, constantly scanning the sky ahead while monitoring radio communications from coast watchers who tracked Japanese aircraft movements from hidden observation posts on enemy-held islands. The early warning network that had saved American forces during the dark days of 1942 now served offensive operations, providing tactical intelligence that allowed American fighters to position themselves advantageously before engaging Japanese formations. At 10:15 hours, approximately 70 miles northwest of Vella Lavella, Davis spotted them, 12 to 15 Japanese fighters, likely Zeros based on their distinctive profile, flying in loose formation at 18,000 feet. The enemy aircraft appeared to be escorting bombers, though the bomber formation remained below and behind the fighters, temporarily obscured by scattered clouds. Davis ordered his formation to maintain altitude and position themselves between the Japanese fighters and their bombers. The tactical advantage was clear. VF-33 held both altitude superiority and positional advantage, allowing them to attack from above, while the Japanese fighters would have to climb through American defensive positions to reach their bombers. The engagement that followed lasted 17 minutes and demonstrated with brutal clarity both the strengths and limitations of the Hellcat as a weapons system. Davis led his division down in a high-speed diving attack, selecting the leading Japanese fighter and opening fire at 400 yards. His 50 caliber rounds converged on the Zero's engine cowling, and the Japanese fighter exploded in a ball of flame that validated every engineering specification regarding the Hellcat's firepower and ammunition load. But as Davis pulled up from his attack, 3 Zeros reversed onto his tail with a speed and precision that demonstrated the extraordinary maneuverability that made Japanese naval fighters so dangerous in turning combat. Davis immediately executed the escape procedure that had been drilled into every Hellcat pilot: full throttle, steep dive to the right, using the F6F's superior diving performance and right roll rate to separate from pursuers who couldn't follow without exceeding their structural limits. The tactic worked exactly as designed. Davis's Hellcat accelerated to over 400 miles per hour in the dive, leaving the Zeros behind as they struggled against control surfaces that stiffened dangerously at high speeds. He pulled out at 8,000 feet, rejoined his wingman, and climbed back into the fight, this time approaching from a different angle with renewed altitude advantage. Across the engagement area, similar exchanges played out as 20 Hellcats and 15 Zeros fought according to fundamentally different tactical doctrines. Japanese pilots attempted to force traditional turning combat, using their aircraft's superior low-speed maneuverability to outturn individual American fighters. But VF-33's pilots refused to accept those terms of engagement. Instead, they used coordinated section tactics, with wingmen protecting each other while maintaining speed and altitude advantages that prevented Japanese fighters from isolating American aircraft. Lieutenant Henry Miller, flying as section leader in the 3rd Division, found himself pursued by 2 Zeros after his initial diving attack destroyed a Japanese fighter. Rather than attempting to turn with his pursuers, Miller radioed his wingman and executed a vertical scissors maneuver that traded altitude for time, while his wingman positioned for a high-side attack on the trailing Zero. The coordination worked perfectly. Miller's wingman destroyed 1 Zero, forcing the second to break off and allowing Miller to reverse position and destroy the remaining Japanese fighter with a deflection shot that demonstrated the Hellcat's stable gun platform characteristics. The pattern repeated throughout the engagement. American pilots attacked from altitude, used their speed and diving performance to escape when pressed, and relied on mutual support rather than individual dogfighting skill to achieve victories. Japanese pilots, trained in traditional fighter tactics that emphasized close-range turning combat, found themselves unable to dictate engagement terms against an enemy that refused to fight according to established rules. When VF-33's Hellcats reformed and returned to Henderson Field, they claimed 9 Japanese fighters destroyed against no American losses. Gun camera footage confirmed 6 kills definitively, with 3 additional claims listed as probable victories. More importantly, all 20 Hellcats returned to base. Several showed battle damage from 20mm cannon strikes, but the armor protection and robust construction that added so much weight had performed exactly as designed, protecting pilots and allowing damaged aircraft to complete their missions. The intelligence debriefing that evening revealed details that would influence American fighter tactics throughout the remainder of the war. VF-33 pilots unanimously reported that Zeros could turn inside Hellcats at low speeds. Several pilots noted that Japanese fighters appeared to have superior climb rates below 14,000 feet. And every pilot emphasized that attempting sustained turning combat with Zeros would likely result in American casualties. But they also reported that Hellcats could escape from Zeros at will using high-speed dives. That altitude advantage allowed American pilots to control engagement timing. That coordinated section tactics prevented Japanese fighters from isolating individual American aircraft, and most significantly, that the combination of firepower, armor protection, and rugged construction gave American pilots decisive advantages in any engagement where they could maintain tactical discipline and refuse to fight according to Japanese expectations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The combat lessons from VF-33's October engagement spread rapidly through the Pacific Fleet fighter community, but the definitive validation of the Hellcats' capabilities would come during massive carrier operations that demonstrated not just individual aircraft performance, but the strategic implications of systematic American advantages in training, logistics, and industrial production. November 23, 1943. The Gilbert Islands operation represented the first major Central Pacific offensive, with American carriers providing air support for marine landings on Tarawa and Makin atolls. The operation would also mark the largest concentration of Hellcat fighters yet assembled, with over 200 F6Fs operating from 6 fleet and light carriers. The strategic situation differed fundamentally from earlier Pacific battles. In 1942, American carriers had operated with desperate caution, always outnumbered, always aware that losing another fleet carrier might prove strategically catastrophic. But by late 1943, American shipbuilding programs had shifted the numerical balance decisively. Essex-class fleet carriers and Independence-class light carriers were commissioning at rates that Japanese industry couldn't match, and each new carrier arrived with full complements of Hellcat fighters, whose performance characteristics finally matched American industrial capacity with tactical capability. Japanese naval aviation responded to the Gilbert Islands operation with heavy airstrikes launched from bases on Tarawa and neighboring islands. On November 23, approximately 40 Japanese aircraft, including Zeros and Betty bombers, attacked American carriers during the initial assault phase. They encountered a coordinated defensive system that combined radar early warning, fighter director control, and Hellcat fighters positioned at multiple altitude levels. The engagement that historians would later call the Tarawa Turkey Shoot demonstrated the full potential of integrated American carrier air defense. Radar operators aboard task force ships detected the incoming Japanese strike at 70 miles range and vectored Hellcats to intercept positions that placed American fighters between the Japanese formation and their carrier targets. The attackers never reached the American fleet. Hellcat pilots claimed 30 Zeros destroyed in exchange for 1 F6F lost, though post-war analysis suggests actual Japanese losses were approximately 22 aircraft. The lopsided exchange rate had multiple causes beyond simple aircraft performance. American pilots benefited from radar early warning that allowed them to position advantageously before engaging. They operated with superior fuel reserves that permitted extended combat without worrying about insufficient endurance for return flights. Their aircraft carried sufficient ammunition for multiple engagements without requiring careful conservation that limited engagement options. And they flew with confidence born from armor protection and aircraft ruggedness that allowed aggressive tactics without accepting unacceptable casualty risks. But underneath these systemic advantages lay the fundamental reality that the Hellcats' design philosophy had proven sound. American pilots weren't out-turning Zeros. They were out-climbing them above 15,000 feet, out-diving them when pressed, out-shooting them with concentrated .50 caliber firepower, and most importantly, outlasting them in sustained operations where attrition rates and replacement aircraft availability mattered more than individual dogfighting performance. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, flying from USS Lexington, exemplified the new generation of Hellcat pilots who understood that winning air superiority required systematic exploitation of all available advantages rather than reliance on individual aerobatic skill. During the November 23 engagement, Valencia destroyed 3 Zeros, using coordinated team tactics that positioned his section for high-side diving attacks while maintaining sufficient altitude and speed to disengage if circumstances became unfavorable. Valencia's tactical approach reflected doctrine that had been refined through months of training and combat experience. Maintain altitude above 18,000 feet when possible. Attack in coordinated pairs or divisions, never individually. Use diving attacks to maximize closure speed and minimize target tracking time. Fire short, controlled bursts at ranges between 300 and 400 yards, and immediately disengage if unable to achieve quick kills, preserving ammunition and fuel for subsequent opportunities. This systematic approach to fighter combat contrasted sharply with Japanese tactical doctrine that emphasized individual pilot skill and close-range dogfighting. The philosophical difference reflected deeper strategic realities about how each nation approached the Pacific War. Japan's limited industrial capacity meant every aircraft and pilot represented an irreplaceable resource that couldn't be quickly regenerated if lost. Japanese tactical doctrine therefore emphasized maximum effectiveness from limited numbers through superior individual capability. American industrial capacity allowed a different calculus. The United States could afford to design fighters that weren't optimal dogfighters if those aircraft could be produced in massive numbers, maintained easily under harsh conditions, and flown successfully by pilots with moderate rather than exceptional training. The Hellcat embodied this philosophy completely. It wasn't the best fighter in any single performance category, but it was good enough in every category that mattered, and it could be produced at rates that overwhelmed Japanese numerical advantages through attrition that America could sustain and Japan couldn't. By December 1943, Navy fighter squadrons operating Hellcats had established air superiority over most contested areas of the Central Pacific. The statistical evidence became overwhelming as engagement reports accumulated. Kill-to-loss ratios consistently exceeded 10-1. Hellcat availability rates remained above 80% despite harsh operating conditions, and pilot survival rates improved dramatically compared to earlier fighters, with armor protection and aircraft ruggedness allowing many pilots to survive combat damage that would have proven fatal in less robust aircraft. But the ultimate validation of the Hellcats' capabilities would come during the massive carrier operations of 1944, when American naval aviation achieved air superiority so complete that Japanese air power effectively ceased to exist as a strategic factor in the Pacific War. The morning of June 19, 1944, broke clear and hot over the Philippine Sea. Task Force 58, the largest concentration of American naval power ever assembled in the Pacific, steamed westward toward the Mariana Islands with 15 fleet and light carriers embarking over 450 Hellcat fighters. The Japanese combined fleet, committed to defending the Marianas as an essential barrier protecting the Japanese homeland, had sortied with 9 carriers and approximately 450 aircraft, determined to inflict a decisive defeat that might shift the strategic balance. The resulting engagement, which American pilots would remember as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, would demonstrate with mathematical precision the cumulative advantages that American carrier aviation had achieved through systematic improvements in aircraft design, pilot training, radar technology, and tactical doctrine. Japanese strike aircraft began launching at 0830 hours from carriers positioned approximately 300 miles west of the American task force. Japanese commanders, following tactical doctrine developed during earlier Pacific battles, planned to attack American carriers with bomber formations escorted by Zero fighters, expecting that superior Japanese pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability would overcome American numerical advantages. But the Japanese strike force flew into a coordinated defensive system that bore little resemblance to the desperate improvisations of 1942. American radar operators detected the incoming formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Fighter director officers aboard task force ships analyzed the radar tracks and vectored Hellcat fighters to intercept positions that placed American aircraft between the Japanese formations and their targets. And the Hellcats themselves, now representing the culmination of 18 months of combat experience and tactical refinement, executed intercepts with a professionalism that reflected systematic training rather than individual heroics. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, flying from USS Lexington, led his division toward the largest Japanese formation, approximately 50 aircraft, including Zero fighters, escorting Judy dive bombers. Vrasiu held altitude advantage, approaching from 24,000 feet, while the Japanese formation labored at 18,000 feet, already beginning their descent toward the American carriers. The tactical situation offered everything a Hellcat pilot could want: altitude advantage, positional advantage, clear weather that allowed visual identification at ranges exceeding 2 miles, and most importantly, targets that were committed to their attack profiles and couldn't maneuver defensively without abandoning their mission. Vrasiu selected a Judy dive bomber and initiated a high-side diving attack, closing at over 400 miles per hour. He opened fire at 400 yards and held the trigger for a 3-second burst that sent approximately 150 rounds into the Judy's engine and cockpit. The Japanese aircraft shed pieces, rolled inverted, and fell away burning. Vrasiu pulled up, regained altitude, and reversed for another attack on a second bomber that had begun its dive toward the carriers below. The engagement repeated identically. High-side approach, 400-yard firing range, 3-second burst, enemy aircraft destroyed. Vrasiu climbed again, repositioned, and attacked a third bomber, then a fourth, then a fifth. In the space of 8 minutes, he destroyed 6 Japanese aircraft, establishing himself as the Navy's leading ace and demonstrating the tactical effectiveness of systematic Hellcat employment against targets that couldn't effectively defend themselves. Across the entire engagement area, similar massacres unfolded as 400 Hellcat fighters intercepted wave after wave of Japanese strike aircraft. The American pilots weren't performing exceptional aerobatics or demonstrating superhuman flying skills. They were simply executing well-practiced tactics that exploited every systematic advantage their aircraft and supporting systems provided. Altitude advantage from early radar warning, speed advantage from more powerful engines, firepower advantage from 650 caliber machine guns with ample ammunition, and most crucially, the tactical discipline to refuse unfavorable engagements while systematically destroying targets that couldn't escape. By mid-afternoon, Japanese carriers had launched 4 separate strike waves totaling approximately 375 aircraft. Fewer than 100 returned to their carriers. American Hellcat pilots claimed 380 enemy aircraft destroyed, with post-war analysis confirming approximately 243 actual kills. American losses totaled 23 aircraft, establishing a kill-to-loss ratio exceeding 10-1 and effectively destroying Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic force. The Battle of the Philippine Sea represented the ultimate validation of Grumman's design philosophy. The Hellcat hadn't won through superior maneuverability or exceptional climb performance. It had won through systematic advantages that allowed American pilots to control engagement terms, attack from favorable positions, and refuse combat when circumstances didn't favor them. The aircraft that Japanese pilots had initially dismissed as merely another heavy American fighter incapable of dogfighting with Zeros had proven to be something far more dangerous, a weapons system optimized for industrial-scale air superiority operations. Admiral Mark Mitchell, commanding Task Force 58, summarized the implications in his after-action report. The Hellcat has given us tactical parity with Japanese fighters and systematic advantages in firepower, protection, and operational flexibility. Combined with superior training, better radar, and overwhelming numerical strength, these advantages have shifted the air superiority equation decisively in our favor. The statistical evidence supported Mitchell's assessment with mathematical precision. By mid-1944, Hellcat-equipped squadrons were achieving kill-to-loss ratios consistently exceeding 15-1. Japanese naval aviation, which had begun the war with the world's most experienced carrier pilots, had been bled white by attrition it couldn't replace. American industrial production had delivered over 7,000 Hellcats by July 1944, with production continuing at rates exceeding 500 aircraft per month. And American pilot training programs were graduating thousands of new aviators annually, each receiving over 300 hours of flight training before reaching combat squadrons. The Hellcat's success reflected more than just aircraft performance. It represented the culmination of American industrial, technological, and institutional advantages that could overwhelm Japanese strengths through systematic application of resources that Japan simply couldn't match. But at the tactical level, in the cockpit where individual pilots fought and died, the Hellcats' characteristics allowed execution of doctrine that turned those systematic advantages into combat victories. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, commander of Air Group 15 aboard USS Essex, became the Navy's top-scoring ace by methodically applying Hellcat tactics that prioritized efficiency over heroics. McCampbell's approach emphasized careful fuel management that extended combat time, ammunition conservation that allowed multiple engagements per mission, and team tactics that prevented Japanese fighters from isolating American aircraft. His 34 aerial victories, all achieved in Hellcats, represented not exceptional flying skill, but exceptional tactical judgment, combined with an aircraft capable of executing that judgment effectively. By late 1944, the question that had preoccupied American naval aviation since Pearl Harbor had been answered definitively. The Hellcat could defeat the Zero, not through superior maneuverability, but through systematic advantages that American pilots had learned to exploit ruthlessly. Japanese pilots still flying Zeros in late 1944 faced not just inferior numbers but an entirely different tactical paradigm that their aircraft and training couldn't effectively counter. The final months of the war saw Hellcats operating with near impunity over Japanese-held territory. During the Philippines campaign, Okinawa invasion, and final strikes against the Japanese home islands, American carrier aircraft encountered minimal Japanese air opposition. The kamikaze attacks that inflicted severe damage on the invasion fleet represented desperation tactics, born from Japan's inability to contest American air superiority through conventional means. The Hellcats' combat record spoke with mathematical certainty. 5,156 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. Kill-to-loss ratios averaging 19-1 over the entire war. 75% of all Navy aerial victories credited to a single aircraft type, and 307 Navy pilots achieving ace status while flying Hellcats, more than any other American fighter of the war. But beyond the statistics lay a more fundamental truth about how air superiority is achieved in industrial-age warfare. The Hellcat succeeded not because it was the best fighter in any single performance category, but because it was good enough in every category that mattered while being producible in quantities that overwhelmed enemy numerical advantages. It could be maintained easily under harsh conditions. It could be flown successfully by pilots with moderate rather than exceptional training, and it could absorb battle damage that would destroy lighter aircraft while protecting its pilot long enough to return to the carrier. Grumman's engineers, working under impossible time pressure with incomplete information about their opponent's capabilities, had designed an aircraft that embodied American industrial philosophy. Make it strong, make it simple, make it work. The result wasn't elegant or revolutionary. It was deliberate, methodical, and overwhelmingly effective. The question Japanese Zero pilots couldn't answer in 1943 had become irrelevant by 1945. Could the Hellcat climb at 4,000 feet per minute, twice the Zero's rate? The historical data reveals a more complex reality. The Zero actually retained superior climb performance at low altitudes. The Hellcat matched it above 14,000 feet, and the entire question missed the point of why American fighters achieved such decisive superiority. The Hellcat won not by outclimbing Zeros but by refusing to fight in the vertical maneuvering arena where Japanese fighters held advantages. It won by using altitude, speed, firepower, and protection to dictate engagement terms. It won by being produced in quantities that made individual performance comparisons strategically irrelevant. And most importantly, it won by being exactly what American naval aviation needed rather than what aerodynamic theory suggested was optimal. Standing on the flight deck of a Pacific Fleet carrier in August 1945, watching the sun set over Japanese home islands that would surrender within days, the Hellcat pilots who had fought their way across 5,000 miles of ocean understood a truth that transcended aircraft performance specifications. Sometimes winning doesn't require being the best at everything. Sometimes it only requires being good enough at the things that matter while maintaining the discipline to refuse fights you can't win and the patience to wait for opportunities that favor your strengths. The Hellcat embodied that philosophy completely, and in doing so, it helped win the largest naval war in human history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.